Hey guys, I'm back with my final video installment for the early großer Hund project, and it turned out really great. Very happy. Thank you very much for all of the wonderfully warm and encouraging words on my health recovery, and I think I'm back to normal, or at least this is as good as it's gonna get. So on with the show. Today I'm going to share with you the final details of my build and matching it up with the groundwork. But before we dive into that, I wanted to share with you some news about the MaK 44 book. It actually sold out. Thank you very much. That's a big surprise. It was fast too. So I really appreciate you for buying it, and thank you very much for the support. Good news is though, the much asked for volume 2 is on pre-order now. It's lunar combat, special operations in lunar orbit, and secure your pre-order now. It's awesome, it's really good. So I hope you really like that. Now back to the großer Hund kit. It was supposed to be a recovery project for me, but I really got inspired whilst making it. The design is very, very cool. I mean, I liked it so much, I built a second one whilst I was working on this one. And I'll share that one with you soon. It's an advanced Dachshund version. I'm going to run through all of the steps since finishing the paint, the water slides, the detailing, weathering and so on, and base adding. So this video might be a little longer than my usual ones. I hope you still like it and make it all the way through with me. So, grab yourself a drink and a snack, and let's get into it. Whoosh. Water slides. Okay, in the previous video, I've shown you how I painted my big dog. Now it's time we move on to the details, and this is actually a really interesting subject too. I was inspired to continue the simplicity of this paint scheme and decided to use the awesome black and white Alger the dog motifs from the kit. I think they look amazing and stand out against the dark yellow paint. Now I have to admit, I love working with decals. They give me a sense of precision and details that I enjoy, but I also know that Hasegawa models decals are not easy to work with. They are very thick and don't conform well on curved surfaces. And MaK kits have lots of curves, right? But don't worry, I have a tip that might help. It's an old school technique that I use sometimes, but be careful with it. You can use a hairdryer to heat up the decals and make them more flexible. Just don't overdo it or you might melt your plastic. I use my fingers to test the temperature, and when it's too hot, I move away and smooth the decals with a Q-tip. This worked really well for me, especially for the small ones on the ears here. They look so neat and flat now. ID bands. This is a brush painted finish. Yes, you heard me right, I painted this beauty with a brush, not an airbrush. And why? Well, because I like challenges and I like to show off my skills. Maybe you can relate. You see, I'm a big fan of the 80s sci-fi aesthetic. The retro future vibe from the 80s really appeals to me. So I've kind of hybrid masked my ID bands. It's more fun that way, don't you think? Of course, it's not easy to paint straight lines and curves with a brush, especially with lacquer paints that dry fast and can be unforgiving. But I have some tricks up my sleeve that I want to share with you. First, I use masking tape as a guide to mark the outlines of the bands and to measure the distances, the length. Then I use a pencil to sketch the curves on the surface. Finally, I used a steady hand and a manky brush to fill in the colors. For real, the MaK helps a little. I chose off-white for the bands because they look great, nicely against the dark yellow base color and fit the Strahl army well. Also let some of the yellow show through the white and added some scratches and scuffs with a sponge file. These kamiyasuri. This gives the impression that the paint has been worn out by rough treatment and in battles. It's pretty cool, right? Decal damage. Now back to those water slides for a quick detail. They will have dried and you can set them further in place with a quick shot of a satin varnish. I used Mr. Super Clear from a spray can for speed and to keep on theme. I've scuffed and scratched them with a sharp tool. Files, panel line engravers, they all work really well actually. Yes, I will also do some paint effects on the markings as well, but this is just another nice level of reality and detail. Looks great. pin wash. Once that's done, we can start adding a little depth to the details, and here I'm using some black and brown oil paints mixed with a little oil-based thinner. Nice and simple. Once it's been drying for a couple of hours, we can soften up the effects a little with a dry brush. Feather them out, drag them down or up. It's easy to get the right kind of fall line this way. This step is a must-do on kits. Chipping. This time for chipping, I've updated my colors just a tad by mixing in some Cavalry Red from Vallejo. However we English speakers mispronounce it, my bad. It's a dark red-brown color that works well with many base colors, especially greens and yellows. I usually mix it in with some black and very dark brown from the same brand to create a rich and warm chipping color. This color also complements the steam curtain discharger detail on my model, which is going to be painted and was, because I'm looking back now, is painted in the same color. Now that you have your chipping color ready, it's time to apply it to your model. There are many ways to do this, but I find one of the easiest and most effective methods is using a sponge. A sponge can create random and natural looking chips and scratches on your model with minimum effort. All you need is a small piece of sponge. I use a couple of different versions, and I like to use it with tweezers too to keep it nice and tight. To use the sponge method, you just need to dip the sponge in your chipping color and dab off the excess paint on a paper towel. You don't want too much paint on your sponge as it will create a blob instead of a chip. Then you need to gently dab the sponge in the areas you want to create chipping effects. You can start with the edges and corners of your model as they are more likely to get damaged and worn out. Then you can add some chips and scratches on other parts of the beast too, such as the panels, rivets, vents, etc. You can vary the pressure and angle of the sponge to create different sizes and shapes of chips as well. This is a great opportunity to talk about a different aspect of painting. I call it the resolution of finish, or jokingly, do I always has to clean the bathroom with a toothbrush? The answer is no. No, you don't have to be that meticulous with simulated chipping. Koyokama Sensei taught me this concept which I think all fine artists understand. It's about how much visual information our eyes and brains can handle and appreciate. Too much can be distracting. And this finish is a good example. The paintwork is very complex because of its rough and textured application. It has a lot of detail already. If you look at my final photos, you can see that the chipping is not very noticeable, unlike the chipping on my White Knight model, which is the main feature. Knowing and understanding how much visual information you're adding to your finish is important if you want to achieve a balanced and elegant result. Sometimes more is not better. Less can be. Shibui and better. Shibui is a Japanese way of explaining it. I'll go into more detail on this. In my new Lunar Combat book, for example, I've written a big section on Shibui, and I'll try to explain it more in videos, and we'll revisit the topic later for you again. So the practical application on this finish is to use larger chips, and I've increased the size of my sponge tool and use this bigger, coarser sponge. It's fun too. It looks like I'm using a big piece of cheese, right? Thanks to Kevin David for the fun and pointing it out. Chunky cheese chipping style for the win. Rust details. Rust is the accent detail for this build, and I'm really happy with myself for showing some restraint. Yes, I love doing rust effects, and I'm always just one cup of coffee shy of getting out of hand with them. So I've used a small piece of sponge to dab on some dark red acrylic paint over the dark mahogany patches I left behind in the paint steps. I make sure to use a random pattern and avoid covering all of the base color. The sponge gives a nice texture and simulates the flaking of the rust. By the way, it manipulates the pigments as they're laid down. Then I repeat the same process with a lighter shade of red, focusing on the edges and corners of the rusted areas. This creates a gradient effect and adds more dimension to the rust. After that, I switch to orange acrylic paint and apply it sparingly over the previous layers. This is the brightest color in my rust palette, and it'll create some highlights and contrast with the dark yellow and dark mahogany for that matter. I don't use too much paint, just enough to make some spots stand out. Swapping to each new color on my gradient and applying it as the previous application is still soft allows for little intermingling of the colors. Just mentioning it so you don't stress out about it either way. If it's already dry, it's fine, and it's also fine if it's still a little wet. Finally, I used an enamel filter to blend and tone down the rust effects a little. I use a soft brush and then apply a thin layer of the filter over the rusted areas. This will unify the colors and make them look a little more natural. The enamel filter also adds a little glossiness and wetness to the rust, which helps to make it look more realistic. I felt that the frame of the upper body was a little flat and needed some work, some love. So I mixed up some of the accent color Cavalry Red into my chipping color mix from before. This is a dark brown color that I used to simulate paint chips and scratches on that yellow base coat. I added a little more water to the mix and used it as a wash over the frame. This created some depth and variation in the color. I also added more black brown in some sections and highlighted some upper sections with more Cavalry Red. This was an experimental step that I didn't plan before, but I really like how it turned out. The last improvement on the rust effects was to add a little more streaking. Although you can see I've already got quite a few streaks in from other paints, I really like the color of this product, and the reddish hue works really great against the yellow rust streaks. So I've applied it to the areas where rust would accumulate and probably run down. Then I used a dry brush to drag the paint downwards and create the streaks. I also did some streaks in the opposite direction, pushing the brush away from me. This helps to create some variation and realism since the parts are curved. It also compensates for the natural, the biomechanical tendency of my hand to curve slightly to the right when pulling down. Gaffs, grease oil and fuel stains are essential for creating realistic machines, even fictional ones like this beastie. The joints on the manipulator and on one of the back leg power tubes are good places to start. Make them look a little more leaky. Then I've switched the color and used the lighter fuel stains on the other leg power tube. I've extended this a little lower too to add a little variety and fun. Just all good. The dirty robot hand. Now, if you want to make your big scary robot hand look more realistic, you need to add some dirt and damage to it. After all, this robot is not a gentle giant, it's a smashing machine. It would have scratches and dents from all the things it has crushed and moved out of its way. And it would also have some mud and dust on it from the ground. So how do you achieve this effect without spending too much time? It was easy. I just used these Tamiya weathering sticks. They are like crayons of paint that you can apply with water and a brush. They come in different colors and shades, so you can choose the ones that match the robot environment well. I use mud and light earth for mine, and you can experiment with other options. Just wet the stick and the brush and dab it on the areas where you want to add some dirt or faux damage. Just don't overdo it though. You want it to look, natural and subtle, and voila. You have a big, scary robot hand that looks like it has been through some adventures. It's seen things. And again, not too much. You want to keep it more shibui, like I mentioned before. Oil paint fine tuning. So this step involved both modeling and photography skills. I took some test shots in the studio and realized that my white 80 bands were too bright and shiny compared to the rest of the model. Yes, I could adjust it and paint it out in post, but that doesn't feel right to me. I want my photos to be an accurate representation of the analog finish of the model. So I decided to apply a filter and add some extra details and effects with oil paints. I put some oil paints on card and let them dry a bit to reduce the oiliness. Then the main colors I used were dark umber green shade and sepia. I also added some ochre for fun and experimentation. I mixed some of the paints with odorless thinner and then carefully brushed them on the ID bands mostly. Since they had a flat varnish on them, the oil paints adhered better and also stained the paintwork slightly, which is what we want. I wanted the ID bands to be a bit, darker and less shiny. I chose a green shade to match the dark yellow color of the model, but I also had a sepia as an alternative and more of a neutral option. I tried both and compared them as I worked, but probably I like the green one better. The result was satisfying, and you can see that the ID bands are now more subdued and look better in the final photos. The base and groundwork. Improving my groundwork skills and setting and making a more narrative-based display are equal goals for me now and this großer Hund series. Wait, is building two of them enough to call it a series? So first off is the plinth. It's a simple wooden pencil holder from Spotlight Australia, and I've added thin plastic card to the sides. The road surface is a thin section of cork cut to shape, and the footprints are formed into two-part epoxy putty, with the big dog's feet, of course. The road surface is a little Liquitex modeling paste smoothed into place, and the earth is an acrylic paste made by the Vallejo folks. All the brands make them, and I swear they all seem to be the same as if they come out of the Duff beer factory in The Simpsons. I did consider using this version. They claim to be for recreating asphalt, and just not so much. The grains are far too coarse, even for this larger scale. Whilst the acrylic mixes are wet, it's like you get free glue, and you can place your other textures now. I've been working on this with some guidance from my good friend Alex Duchamp, whose skill and advice on groundwork has been priceless for me. Copy real ground, don't just make it up. He's absolutely correct, and his words even led me to developing a more detailed narrative for my base. Instead of the big dog standing on a dry desert type base, which I'll confide I had initially been tempted to lazily think. Instead, I realized I wanted to show it on a recently burnt scrubland type base, perhaps the kind of bushland you can imagine here in Australia, and the kind we would have around a spaceport the großer Hund has been tasked with defending in my overly active imagination. So this stronger narrative then had me looking for very particular reference photos to recreate, and that helped a bunch. Letting this dry and cure overnight, I've then airbrushed on a nice flat black primer coat onto the groundwork. It's real color, flat black, and then also sprayed a thicker surfacer type black paint along the sides. The leaves. I've always been curious about using leaves in my groundwork, and I found these leaf punches on HLJ from Wave. They are much bigger than the usual 135 scale ones, and they look like they could fit the Australian bush. I decided to try using aluminum foil for the leaves, and I punched out some shapes. Next, I worked on the groundwork and added some color effects. I used Tamiya flat brown with some water and worked it onto the surface. I've not gone too heavy. I've worked it on gently. I left some areas with the black and the earthy tone from the Vallejo product too. Then, because Tamiya flat brown is a warm color and it will contrast well with the dark yellow of the Hund. Then, for the road asphalt, I did the same thing with Tamiya German grey and water. It's another warm color that will look good against the dark yellow. Then I glued those leaves in place with some wood glue, and I've only put them in 3 spots. I wanted them to look like they just fell after the fire. Too many leaves might not look right. The foil needed a primer for the acrylics to stick then, so I used some mahogany surfacer, which was perfect. I also painted the details on the steam curtain discharges while I was at it. Same sort of colors I was using on the leaves and groundwork. I used my favorite cavalry red again for one, basalt gray for 2 others. The last one got rubber black. The different colors are to show different loadouts like modern vehicles. And finally, I used these colors and some rust tones to paint the leaves for continuity. I think it looks cool enough. Burnt effects. Now it was time to try the experimental step of the burnt effects. I had no idea how to do it since, over my years I've not stumbled across a tutorial for it. So I followed Alex's advice again. He said to copy it from the reference, where you can see some of the rocks I saw in the photos were charred, or they had at least soot and dust over them, black dust. So that sounded easy enough, so I went with black and started to overbrush carefully. It was like doing the opposite of a highlight, and it looked really good straight away. I was really impressed. I also added a little more depth to the groundwork with some track wash into the details, and it looks good, like it's a little damp after some rains, and it contrasts with that burnt feeling. So yeah, I like it. Attaching the Hund to the base. I used a 2mm drill bit to make holes in the Hund's feet and the base, and then I inserted some 2mm very short lengths of brass rod into them. I had fun using two different kinds of glue for this. I applied CA glue for the brass rod and that carpenter's woodworking glue to the feet, and then I gently pressed them into the groundwork. Next, I always enjoy giving my machines a sense of weight. So want to slightly build up the area around the foot contacts. Feet contacts. Foot contact. Is it plural? If there's one thing that drives me nuts, it's huge machines hovering above the ground in the air. So I've simply sculpted in another acrylic earth product to carefully give such an illusion. I've also used a different product with different texture to give the idea that it's a layer from underneath. I might be overthinking it, but let's also put a little of that on the Hund's lower legs as well, to give it the feeling that it's been kicking up some stuff. Once this is dry, tap me a flat brown again to bring the colors together, and then that counter highlight with black to continue the burnt effect for the area. The last step for me then was to wash in a little camo black brown to help uniform the colors a little, and then we're done. My gratitude. That was the awesome early Grosser Hund kit. I hope you enjoyed the retro futuristic paint and narrative base. If you did, please hit like and subscribe. Huge thanks go to my Patreon supporters for enabling me. You can join them and get more awesome stuff. You will see more photos and sneak peeks from my books, download high quality studio photos, and see detailed work in progress steps. We have a Discord server where you can share your work and get tips and feedback. You'll meet amazing people on the same journey. Please join us today. You're amazing. And for more of my work, please visit paintonplastic.com and check out my books. The links are in the description. Thanks always.